My name is Phil Cooke. I want to talk a little bit about where do we go from here. As church leaders who have been live streaming for so long, now that we're getting back to normal, where do we go from here? What have we learned from that experience and where do we go? So that's really where I wanted to focus, and I'm going to do it, I'm going to be casual. I wanted to share some things right off the top of my head. I have to say I've not shared this before with anybody. And so I may mess up a little bit, and I've got some notes here just in case. So I beg your forgiveness, pardon me, but I just wanted to be honest and be authentic and be real and give you the things that's burning most on my heart. You know, it's interesting that if anything good came out of the COVID experience, it was that church leaders, pastors, media leaders really were reawakened to the power of media. I know pastors, many years, our team at Cooke Media Group here in Los Angeles, our team for many, many years has worked with churches, helping them understand live streaming and how to maximize it. And over the years, we've had so many pastors that would say, well, Phil, I don't mind live streaming my services, but that's not real ministry. In the same way, so many people say Christian radio or Christian television, or those things aren't real ministry. Let me tell you, those pastors changed their tune quickly when that church shutdown happened in 2020. They completely changed their thinking, and it was quite remarkable to see what came out of that. Certainly a lot of people struggled, but I've heard such amazing stories of how God used the media to transform so many things. One pastor called me here in the U.S., called me and said that we have 900 people in our church. He said before the shutdown, he said we had 28 subscribers to our YouTube channel. And he said, but now, 3 or 4 months into the shutdown, we have 23,000 subscribers to our YouTube channel. He said, we have 900 people in our church, but we regularly get 30 to 40,000 people watching our live stream. And he said, I've had 1.5 million people view my Easter address. So he said, it's interesting that, or in my Easter message, he said, it's interesting that I'm a pastor. He said, I feel guilty saying this, but I'm in no hurry to go back to our building. He said, we're making more of an impact online than we've ever made in our community in our entire history. So you hear stories like that, and trust me, for me, it's not either or. It's not being in the physical church or being online. It's how do we do both and? How do we create an environment where both experiences are valid and are making an impact in the culture? And I'm just so grateful to hear and see those kind of experiences over and over and over again in the church. And one of the funny things that's kind of you'll get a kick out of is that our offices are here in Burbank. My home is in Los Angeles, and I'm in the valley above downtown Burbank, or on the hill above downtown Burbank. And from my home office, I can look out over the valley and see Walt Disney Studios, Warner Brothers Studios, Universal Studios, Cartoon Network, some of the biggest film studios in Hollywood. And I can tell you, during that period, that shutdown period in 2020, those Hollywood studios were ghost towns. Nobody was producing anything. Nobody was doing anything. It was just an interesting thing to see. And yet, during that same period, the church stepped up. Christian broadcasters like UCB stepped up and started increasing what they were doing and focusing what they were doing on the needs of people that were struggling at that time. Churches stepped up and started live streaming. And so for that period, that year, the church, the Christian community produced more media than Hollywood did. I just think that's really remarkable. It reminds me so much of at the very beginning of the film industry, 1898 to about 1914, scholars will tell us that the church produced more movies than Hollywood back then. I was at a church about, 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, in New Jersey, across the river from Manhattan. And they had done some remodeling. It was a very historic church built at the turn of the last century. And they were remodeling, and they knocked out a wall in the back of the sanctuary and were shocked to find a 35 millimeter movie projector hidden away inside that wall. And they did some research and discovered in the turn of the last century, 1900, 1910, 1920, they would have movie night at the church. And they would show Christian films as an evangelistic outreach for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people every Saturday night. And about 1930, 1940, they started focusing on other things. The war had broken out, and they started focusing on other ministry opportunities. And so it was a lot of trouble to pull that projector out of the building, so they just boarded it up. And people completely forgot about it and didn't realize it until it was remodeled maybe 15 years ago. But it was a great reminder that when technology first comes online, so often it's the church that embraces it. I remember in the 1800s, the American Bible Society had more steam-driven printing presses than any organization in the world. That was the state of the art for printing presses at the time, and yet it was American Bible Society that had the most of them. In fact, it's interesting that Paul laid the foundation of the early church using the technology of his day, which was letters. And then in the 1500s, an obscure monk named Martin Luther embraced Gutenberg's press and started the publishing industry as we know it today, literally transforming the world. Most people will say the printing press transformed the world probably more significantly than any other thing. In fact, in the year 2000, Life magazine here in the U.S. Did a special edition on the greatest achievements of the last millennium. And number one on that list was Gutenberg printing the Bible. Well, I'll tell you something. I think that achievement is going to be overshadowed by the digital revolution that's happening today. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the question now is, where do we go from here? Where do we go? What do we do now as leaders in the Christian media world, in the church, in the Christian and business community out there? Where do we go from here? So I want to give you 5 things to think about on this incredibly important UCB celebration. I want to give you 5 things to think about as we start positioning ourselves for the future. Number 1 is value your creative team. Whether you're a Christian broadcaster, a business leader, a church leader, understand your creative team. As I said before, I think that pastors and ministry leaders during the COVID shutdown completely rethought how important a creative team was. It's not an exaggeration to say that there are hundreds, if not thousands of churches around the world that are still alive and in business today because that creative or communication and media team stepped up and created those live streaming connections with their congregation. I'll tell you, we've never seen just how important Christian broadcasting is until we saw that shutdown. So I think that number 1, we need to understand how to value our creative team that creates this stuff, because we do live in a creative culture. This economy is driven by media, and we need to think about how to value our creative team. The second thing I would encourage you to understand is, particularly for churches, live streaming is only the beginning. You know, so many leaders thought we were all heroes when we figured out this live stream thing and made it successful and started keeping those churches alive. But the truth is, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure as the UCB team realized how they reshifted and refocused their broadcasting to minister to people going through this crisis was just another great example of how we need to respond immediately to changes in the culture. The live stream is just the beginning. My question to leaders is, how are you connecting during the week with your congregation or your supporters or your audience? Are you using Instagram Live? Are you using YouTube and other tools to connect with people on a regular basis? I think it's important just not be satisfied that we're doing a live stream now. That's just the start. That's just the start. We need to think about how we could use technology and media to really go to the next level in changing this culture for the gospel. I think that's so very important. And by the way, for those pastors listening, I think understanding, how your digital experience matches your physical experience. Obviously, they're 2 different things. And as I said earlier, it's not either or, it's both and. But I want you to think in terms of a hybrid experience. I don't care whether people engage with you through the online world or engage with you through the TV broadcasting world or radio broadcasting world or your physical church. That needs to be a hybrid experience. They need to be the same, as much as possible, the same kind of experience, so that they understand who you are, what your message is, what you represent, and how God can change their life. That's so important. Think hybrid when it comes to using all these platforms to share your message. The third thing I would say is, I think it's important to realize that something that thrills me a lot is that leaders are now rethinking what church really could be. They're exploring new models. Church has been pretty much the same in my entire lifetime. The same order of service, the same kind of service. Certainly we went through it in the 60s and 70s, the Jesus people. We started rethinking the contemporary service, but it's still not that different from what it was during our time, during my father's time, my grandfather's time, maybe different music, but the order of service, the way we do church is pretty much the same. But yet, during this shutdown, leaders have started rethinking that model. I'll give you some examples. For instance, one major church here in the U.S. is going to continue, even though we're back in the building, they're going to continue live streaming 3 Sundays a month. And on that 4th Sunday, they're going to have a Friday night giant worship experience concert. On Saturday, they're taking the entire church out to the streets to help the needy, the homeless, the poor. Then on Sunday, they're going to have an amazing blowout worship service in the church on Sunday. But for the other 3 Sundays a month, they're going to be live streaming and focus everything on that fourth Sunday. Certainly, they're doing smaller online events for small groups and things like that, but they're rethinking how they're doing church. A number of churches I've heard from are following kind of a Catholic daily mass model. For instance, Catholics have a daily mass at many of their churches where in the morning, maybe about 7 o'clock, they'll have a much smaller service every day of the week. I have a close friend who's a Broadway actor, and he travels around the country doing Broadway shows on tour, and he's Catholic, and he tells me that in most major cities he's in, he can find a local Catholic daily mass that he can get up, attend on about 7 o'clock on the morning every day of that week, and then go about doing the Broadway show on tour and traveling wherever he's going. So a lot of churches are moving to that kind of model where, for instance, one church here in Florida is doing a daily Facebook group, and they're doing an hour at 7 in the morning of teaching, a little bit of worship, devotional time, and they're getting 600 to 700 people showing up every morning at 7 o'clock in that Facebook group with that pastor. A number of churches are doing that. I know one pastor that has done 465 continuous communion days in a row. He has communion every morning online, and he's getting hundreds and hundreds of people that will tune in to see that. So it's interesting how pastors are finally really embracing the potential of media to the point they're changing their thinking about church and the way they do things. And I think it's really remarkable. One of the most interesting things I had the opportunity to do during the shutdown, during the church shutdown, I did Zoom teaching to about 200 pastors across Russia. I taught about 165 pastors in South America, another 60 Portuguese-speaking pastors in Portugal, Brazil, and Angola, all helping them maximize their live stream to better connect with their congregations during that shutdown. But one of the most interesting Zoom teachings I did was with 50 pastors here in the U.S. that were planting churches 100% online. Now think about that, 100% online. Now, here's the thing. You may like those ideas. You may not like some of those ideas, the daily mass kind of concept or the communion every day, whatever. You may like them or not. But the fact is, I'm thrilled that pastors are thinking outside the box. Some of them are throwing the box out the window. I think it's just time that we started rethinking how we can engage this culture more effectively. Now remember, it's not about watering down our theology or our doctrine. It's about how to use media and communications to more effectively engage with our congregation, our culture, and the world at large. So I love that. Now, the fourth thing I would tell you is, as you think about the future going from here, is we need to learn to lead creative people. If there was one thing I would encourage every leader listening and watching this to do, it would be learn to lead creative people. I'll tell you, this is a creative economy, as I mentioned before. And I think it's funny, John Maxwell has done a brilliant job, and others have done a brilliant job of creating such amazing leadership resources out there. But there's not that much on how to lead creative people. And yet, creative people are going to drive this economy in the future. One survey, IBM did a study of They asked 200 CEOs of major corporations here in the United States, what's the single most important thing CEOs need to understand for the future? And their one response, overwhelmingly, was creativity. And I believe with all my heart, as Christian leaders, we need to understand how to inspire, motivate, and lead creative people, because that's the way we're going to break through and really make an impact in the culture today. So if you don't listen to anything else I say during this talk, walk away with the understanding that you need to explore. I'm going to be writing more about it at my blog at philcooke.com, because I think it's so important that we understand the key principles of leading creative people. And the last thing I would say is number 5, that is, we really need to understand the depth, the significance of the digital revolution that we're going through. Like I said, Paul laid the foundation of the church through technology of his day. Martin Luther changed the world through technology of his day. I think that understanding just how great the digital revolution is going to be significant for the church moving forward. Most people, when we switch from analog to digital, most of us thought, oh, it's about getting a new TV set. But let me tell you, it's much, much deeper. It's impacting education, business, medicine, law, entertainment, media. It's impacting so much. It's impacting church and ministry in ways we never dreamed. And I think it's so important. One of the things to think about is that digital revolution has allowed my friend Bobby Grunwald to invent the YouVersion Bible app. You know, that Bible app that's the most downloaded app in the world. I think right now they have nearly 500 million people have downloaded that app. It's allowed people like producer Dallas Jenkins to crowdfund his movie idea on the life of Christ called The Chosen. It's become the most popular crowdfunding project in history. It's allowed a single person to use social media to launch a movement and a cause and impact the entire world. So when we understand the impact of digital media, we start really changing the way we communicate, changing the way we lead, and changing the way we live our lives. I wrote my recent book, Maximize Your Influence, How to Make Digital Media Work for Your Church, Your Ministry, and You, because I really felt, I wrote it in the middle of the pandemic, because I felt like pastors, leaders, professional media people need to understand a reference on how to engage with this digital world. So in the book, I not only talk about websites and social media, video, TV, radio, I also talk about how to speak and teach and preach to a digital audience. I talk about crisis communication. What happens when things go wrong at your organization? It's going to be related, I can bet, to a social media problem or a mistake along that line. How do we deal with those things? And the last thing I would probably just say is, you know, when we think about the future, we have to just think about, where do we go with this? What do we do with it? I think one of the most important things, if I'll just be honest, is we have to start getting a much better vision of where we could potentially go in this changing culture that we live in. I don't mean in a kind of a wacky new age way, but I think a crystal clear vision and understanding and a picture in our mind about where God could take us 5, 10, 15 or more years from now, and how digital and digital media, communication, creativity, how those things could impact our message for the future. It's interesting. I tell people that 10 or 20 years ago, we wouldn't take a leader seriously if he said, you know what, I'm a leader, but I don't really do books. I don't take books very seriously. Well, I think in the future, people are going to feel the same way about someone who says, I'm a leader, but I don't take digital media seriously. I don't take social media seriously. I don't take communication and media seriously. I think that's going to be the cornerstone of Christian leadership in the future. And we have to have that crystal clear vision of what that could look like for you and your organization. I have a friend here in Los Angeles, a very successful producer named Ken Wales, Christian guy, brilliant producer, quite elderly now. And a number of years ago, Ken started his career in Hollywood being an intern to Walt Disney. And he would tell me stories about working with Walt when he was a young man in his 20s. And he said Walt was obsessed with doing everything bigger and better. I mean, it's all he could think about. How do we do everything bigger and better? And he said even when he built Disneyland here in California, he was, even before he finished, he was already thinking, you know what, we could do this bigger and we could do it better. And as soon as they did the groundbreaking, or excuse me, as soon as they did the ribbon cutting and finished Disneyland in California, he immediately started thinking about doing it in another place in a better way. So he took his engineers, his designers, his creative team, and he took them to Orlando, Florida, started buying property, and started working. But most people don't remember that Walt got cancer during that time, and before Disney World could open, he had passed away. And when they did finally have opening ceremonies, they had celebrities there and ribbon cuttings and parades, and they had Ken told me they had a big bleacher set up there, and he said the interesting thing was Walt's widow was there in the bleachers. And she was obviously, sad that Walt couldn't be there because he had passed. And one of the young executives was trying to be gracious and kind and leaned over to her in the middle of the opening ceremony and said, whispered in her ear, it's such a shame Walt can't be here to see this. And without missing a beat, she leaned back to him and said, oh, no, you don't understand. Walt saw it. That's why it's here. Think about that for a minute. Walt saw it. That's why it's here. My question to you is, what do you see? When you think about the future, when you think about where we go from here, post-COVID, post-pandemic, when you think about reaching the culture that is probably the most polarized culture in the history of the world, what do you see? How could God use you in the future of your ministry and your purpose and in your life? I think UCB has been really critical in supporting me and the efforts I've been doing to help try to get the word out there, to make leaders aware of just how important communication and media is for the future. And I would encourage you, start thinking, start having that visual idea of what God could do with you and using media, film, video, broadcast TV, short videos, websites, social media, whatever. What could God do with you and using those platforms to change the world? That's the future. we need to be thinking about.